Welcome everyone. Today we're going to present on navigating longitudinal collections with Colectica Portals. I'm Catherine Lavender, the NACDA project manager, and also speaking we'll have the NACDA director, Dr. James McNally, and co-founders of Colectica, Jeremy Iverson and Dan Smith. Okay. So today we're going to talk about NACDA and longitudinal data. We're going to talk a little bit about Colectica and explore the portals. And we're going to get some demonstrations on how to create customized data sets and codebooks. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of using the portal versus the benefits of downloading from the NACDA site. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. James McNally, the director of NACDA.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending our webinar. This is an opportunity to share with interested researchers some of the work we've been doing to improve access to longitudinal data. NACDA, the Program on Aging, has been funded continuously by the National Institutes on Aging for almost 40 years. And our mission, our purpose in life is to organize and share research data with the research community in a format that facilitates its use. We try to simplify, organize, and promote the use of NIA-funded research. Most recently, we've begun to focus almost exclusively on the improvement of longitudinal data. And this is a report on some of the progress we've made in making longitudinal data more accessible to the broader research community. I think, yes, down. Where are we going here? There we go. Having a little trouble paging, but we'll figure it out. Stupid mouse. There we go. Come on. Just one click here. That's all I'm looking for. There we go. NACDA is part of ICPSR, which is arguably the largest repository of secondary research data in the world. NACDA is the program that specifically focuses on aging, life course, and health. I'm the director. I've been directing NACDA for a little over 20 years, and Catherine Lavender is the NACDA project manager, and she actually does probably 98% of the actual work that makes NACDA successful. We're part of ISR at the University of Michigan, and everything we do works on the concept that we will make your data better. We will help you do research. We will help you be successful in your research careers. That is why we exist. So we always encourage people not to be shy about contacting us with questions. And if they have interest in research, to talk to us, because we may be able to point you to a data set that will help you perform the project you're interested in doing. So we're there to serve you, to facilitate your research. Why is longitudinal data important? Well, I assume that your presence at the webinar says you already know why longitudinal data has value. It's been a long process to get to the point where we are now, where we have actually a large selection of longitudinal data sets that researchers can choose from. The primary advantage of longitudinal data is obviously observing change over time, looking at development trends, and being able to make observations about how people react to changing circumstances. This makes it much more powerful than cross-sectional studies, which can be employed for cohort analysis, but otherwise just give you a snapshot of what's going on in time. They're also flexible. A longitudinal study can adjust to changing circumstances. We're seeing that now with the COVID-19 crisis, as many of our major longitudinal studies are including questions and resources into better understanding the impacts of COVID on the aging population and the population at large. So longitudinal data is essential to the research process. The next question is always, why is longitudinal data presented the way it's presented? Traditionally, and up until this day, the normal way to present longitudinal data for reuse is in separate waves, a series of releases. So you have wave 1, then a new study is wave 2, and so on. This is a problem because the researcher has to spend a considerable amount of time, money, and effort in organizing these separate waves into a longitudinal data set that can look and change across time. It also explains why many of the early uses of longitudinal data were actually cross-sectional. The SIP surveys, for example, the majority of the early papers and articles using SIP longitudinal data actually only looked at a single wave of data. This was driven by past limitations, and now it's just a habit. When longitudinal data first became generally available, studies such as the longitudinal study of aging from NCHS, for example, computers simply couldn't handle large data collections effectively. You had to break your studies down into pieces. So it made a certain amount of sense to release it in waves. So it could be handled, you could extract the variables you were interested in and build the data set. Similarly, analysis software had significant limitations in those days, driven by limited amounts of memory and also the capacity of the software itself. It actually, programs such as SAS and later on Stata would not function if you had too many variables or too many cases. These limitations no longer exist. Computers can handle pretty much any amount of data we want to throw at them, and the software has evolved as well. But still, from the perspective of an investigator with a longitudinal data set, there is a distinct pressure to make this data available quickly to the research community. And to do that, it's much easier to release it each wave as it becomes available. This has resulted in a situation where more emphasis has been placed on releasing the data, which is a good thing. We don't want to imply that that's a bad thing at all. We want the data out as quickly as possible. But once you commit to that strategy, then it becomes difficult to backtrack, to harmonize wave 1 with wave 2 with wave 3, to adjust the documentation, to clearly show any changes in question text. In other words, it takes a lot of resources to retrospectively harmonize a longitudinal data set. And that's essentially one of the roles of NACDA. We take on that function as much as possible for key NIA-funded studies. There's been a number of efforts to manage longitudinal data over the years. One of the earliest responses was a crosswalk. This is usually just a document or an Excel spreadsheet that lists the variables in each wave of data next to each other, so you can see which variables exist across all waves, which ones were dropped out, which ones changed. It's useful, but it's very static. It's just a document. It doesn't help you search. It doesn't help you really understand the nature of the data. An improvement of that is a question concordance, something like the health and retirement study has, where you can search for specific variables and it will line them up so you can see how the pattern changes across time. And it's also much easier to find specific themes or refinements. So this is an improvement over the old-fashioned crosswalk and a useful tool. At one point, there was a flurry of projects that released pre-prepared merging scripts in SAS or SPSS or Stata that would help you put data sets together. This has become less common with time, primarily due just to the effort and resources required to do this kind of work. More recently, we've seen special developmental projects. The RAND HRS is probably the classic example of a project that retroactively refits HRS data and creates seamless longitudinal files for research. This is a fantastic contribution to the research community, but it is also a very expensive and time-consuming one. We're glad that the RAND continues to provide this resource, but it is an aftermarket improvement. Similarly, there's projects such as the Gateway to Global Aging Data, which works very hard to organize and standardize the waves of independent studies, NIA international studies, largely sister studies of the HRS. They've done an excellent job of allowing people to move forward with comparative research. It's metadata, it's scripts, it's programs that allow you to do the merging, but it's organized in a very nice way. You still go to the investigators to get the data, but once you have it, then you can use this kind of resource quite effectively to move forward quickly in an analysis project. So these are all good things. We're pushing in a slightly different direction. Over the past probably decade, really, in truth, the National Institutes of Aging has been placing a greater emphasis on the management of longitudinal data as opposed to single surveys or cross-sectional data. Little over 4 years ago, they had a new RFA, archiving and sharing of longitudinal data resources on aging. When NACDA was able to successfully compete for this award, it changed our mission rather dramatically. Up until that time, we had been a P30 mechanism, and we embraced all kinds of data as our mission. This particular new focus on longitudinal data required that we have a new mission and to explicitly support the development of tools and approaches to facilitate the use of longitudinal data. We don't ignore other data sets, but our primary focus is now to improve longitudinal data supported by NIA and to make it easier to use. One of the outcomes of this change was NACDA's relationship with Colectica. Colectica is probably the premier provider of DDI-Lifecycle capacities, and you need something like the DDI-Lifecycle to manage longitudinal data effectively. They'll show you some of the features shortly, but this is the tool that allows us to organize not only the variables, but the data itself. So you can create a seamless longitudinal file that meets your research needs and download it to your computer and move forward with your work in a very rapid and effective manner. Keep going back. There we go. So NACDA is here. This is our website. It's very easy to find, and particularly we want to emphasize the data resources. We have tools, we have guidelines on how to access restricted data. We have special pages for studies we support but do not archive ourselves, such as NHATS and HRS, which are ably managed by their investigators. We also have special pages for the MIDAS and NCHAP studies, very important NIA studies that NACDA manages and provides webinars and some work on population health. So next, we'll turn the presentation over to Colectica and let them show why it's important to use DDI-Lifecycle in managing longitudinal data. Thank you. So
Thank you, Jim.
Catherine, if you want to. Yep, got it, Dan? Good.
Yep, so my name is Jeremy Iverson. I'm with Colectica. And can somebody verify that my screen is showing?
Hi, Jeremy, this is Anna. We can see your screen and we see the presentation
Perfect.
slides.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Catherine and Jim, for starting things out. So again, my name's Jeremy. Dan Smith is also on the call today, and we are co-founders at Colectica. Colectica is a software company where we work on statistical and survey data documentation software. One of the things we kind of pride ourselves on is we base everything we do on these open standards that we'll talk a little bit about. Most of our customers are national statistics organizations, larger longitudinal studies, and other research data producers. So people use our software to do a few things. Some of them are cataloging those longitudinal data sets, documenting them in great detail, and then the main goal is to publish them usually in interactive web portals that we'll take a look at in a minute, but also as code books or data dictionaries in your more traditional PDF formats and things like that. So the goals of doing all this with Colectica and with DDI-Lifecycle are several. So one is to let researchers discover data across data sets where they're not sure what might exist in those data sets. And once they find some interesting data, to understand that data and its provenance, where did it come from? And from the data producer's perspective, of course, the advantage of all this is to allow those data to be more widely used and more widely cited. So the Colectica software platform itself has a few different components in it. We have several desktop tools, and these are the tools that you use to create, ingest, and edit the information, the metadata content. And it's all based on this DDI-3 lifecycle standard, but the goal of these tools is to make it so you don't really need to know the technical details of that standard. These are point and click interfaces that let you ingest and document data resources. Secondly, and these two kind of go together, Colectica Repository and Colectica Portal. Repository is the central storage location for metadata within an organization. It is based on standard web services, and it keeps an audit trail of all the information that comes into it, so you get kind of revision tracking as part of using the repository. Colectica Portal is the web front end that we're going to take a look at today, and that lets you browse the information, search the information, and pull down data in cases where that's configured. And finally, we do have a software developer kit, or SDK, which lets you extend the Colectica platform to create connectors to different data resources beyond the ones that are built in, to create custom reports or code books, and do all sorts of other things too, including work with the DDI model. So some unique features that we have and that we'll take a look at are when we talk about data documentation, it's great to document the data sets that exist, but when we're working with the DDI standard metadata and with Colectica, what we really like to do is get into the details at the variable level and document every column of data, ideally including where that data came from. If it was a survey question, let's document the source question. If it was a variable from some other data set that some computations might have affected, let's document those transforms. Secondly, and this is especially useful for longitudinal studies, we offer very rich concordance capabilities. So to document the same things that are measured across time, or as we'll see in the NACDA case today, even across different studies. And finally, again, all this concordance information, the variable level documentation lineage, it's all stored in these open standards. So this information can be taken from one place and moved to another, across tools, across sites, whatever you like. So there's a lot of advantages in using standards like DDI and GSIM and other ones. All right, so with that, I'm going to switch over to showing the NACDA portal here. And I'm going to start showing just concordance within a single longitudinal study. So this portal is kind of a pilot that has done cross-study concordance for the NSHAP and for the NHATS studies. But to start off with, I'm just going to look at NSHAP individually to get a feel for some of what the portal can do. So if I go to the Explore tab up here, I can explore either the cross-study concordance, or in this case, I'm going to start with NCHAP. And what we'll see is on the left, all the topics that the NACDA folks have come up to organize the NCHAP study. And so if we look, maybe we care about social networks, we can see what variables are available here. Down the left are kind of the general things we're measuring, so marital status, for example. And on the right, we can see there's 3 NCHAP waves documented here, and we'll see the variable name in each of them. So in this case, they're all the same variable name, which is convenient. That doesn't necessarily need to be true. I can click here to get some details if I want. So what do the frequencies look like across the different waves? We can see that. How is this measured across the different waves? We can see that with a code comparison. In this case, it's very consistent, which is nice. That's not always the case, in which case this view could be helpful to show changes in the coding. If we want to learn a bit more about any of the individual variables from these separate data sets, we can click on that variable and we'll be taken to the variable detail page where we'll get whatever other documentation they provided. So in this case, we've got the name and label, of course, the frequencies like we just saw for this single data set, but also the question that was used to collect the data in the first place. And we can even link to that question sometimes within a full survey instrument. We'll see that a bit more when we look at the NHATS study as well. Okay, so that's marital status, which is a coded variable. If we look around for some other types of variables, perhaps age, which is numeric in this case, we'll get kind of the visual comparison across 3 waves of this study for the age as well with a box and whisker plot. All right, so that's one study, which is useful on its own because whether you're familiar with the study or not, it's a nice way to browse and find what data are available, what the variables are in the different data sets. But that becomes even more powerful when maybe you want to do some research and you're not sure which studies have the data you want. In this case, we can browse across the separate studies. So again, for this kind of pilot portal, it's the 2 studies, NCHAP and NHATS. There's no reason this can't be expanded to even more studies. So when I browse to this view, same view, except now we're looking at some topics that are common across the studies. And these were also prepared by the NACDA staff. So if I wanted to look at maybe again, social life, we'll see in this case, not just the NCHAP variables from their 3 waves, but also all the variables from NHATS across their 8 waves in this case. And so we can see, volunteer work. You can see it's measured a bit differently, like yes or no in one case versus how many times a year in the other. And that's fine. So they're measuring a similar thing, but they're represented differently. If we go to the demographics, we could look again at, I believe, marital status we looked at before. So we'll see the 3 we just saw, but then we'll also see all the NHATS marital status variables. And in this case, the variable names are different. So this is even more helpful to say that, in wave 2 in their OP data set, it's named this, OP2 marital stat versus OP1 marital stat or HH1 marital stat. But all those variables are measuring marital status. Again, if we look at age, this is a more interesting one to point out here perhaps because it's not a simple one-to-one mapping. We have age in NCHAP, the first 3 columns, but NHATS doesn't measure age directly. Instead, it measures birth year and birth month and year. And so it kind of takes 2 variables from NHATS to map to the single variable in NCHAP. But we can still declare that using our metadata here. And then we can present that in a view like this that allows researchers to see, okay, I need both of these variables from NHATS to be comparable to the single variable from NCHAP. Right. So, and again, from this view, just like before, we can go into the details of any individual variable if we care to. So if we wanted to take a look at NHATS, perhaps, and their marital status variable, we can see how it's coded compared to NCHAP. In this case, NHATS has actually documented their full surveys. So we can see the source question that was used to gather the data. And we can also see what was asked immediately beforehand, immediately afterwards. If there's any logic around this, we can see that. We can jump to the full survey instrument and see how that's documented if we'd like to do that as well. All right, so that is browsing with this Explore view. You don't always necessarily want to browse. Perhaps search would be a more useful approach. So we have this search view, and I'm going to search across everything here. So if I'm coming at it knowing I want to think about marital status, I can search for that and jump into this item, which is going to show us all of the things that measure marital status. So we'll see a similar view, kind of giving that concordance across the two studies, NCHAP and NHATS. The reason the NHATS is not showing us the summary statistics here, it's just showing the variable names and the data sets they're in, is because NHATS does not include the summary stats and the frequencies within the metadata, whereas NCHAP does. And that's intentional on their part, it's just a decision they made. But if you did have more summary stats, this view could be more filled out. But it can still be useful just for the code comparison to see that, okay, NHATS is using these different missing value codes. They're using different labels, all capitalized. Perhaps that's the only difference, but perhaps there's also wording differences in some cases. And so you can get a comparison of how things are represented differently across two different studies or many different studies, and even within a single study if the representation changes at some point. So this project hasn't gone the next step, but you could picture going the next step where you can actually map at the code level, you know, -1 in NHATS is the same as whatever the missing value code is in NCHAP, or that 1 is the same in both, so that's an easy mapping. Or that perhaps in some cases 3 means separated in NHATS and 4 means separated in NCHAP. You could, within DDI, you could create that sort of mapping and power a harmonization effort like that. So that's an idea for a future expansion to this project. All right, so beyond being able to explore and search for data across these studies, it's also possible to keep track of variables you're interested in one or both studies, and then to create data extracts from that. So in this portal, again, only NCHAP is providing the actual data, NHATS is only metadata. But if we go into NCHAP and we decide we care about that marital status variable, I can use this plus button that's next to all these. And in this case, if I hit plus, it's going to add 3 variables to my basket. It adds every variable in the row from all the 3 different data sets for the 3 different waves. If I wanted to throw age in there as well, we could do that. And then I can go to my basket. You can have multiple baskets, so I'll click through to the one I have. And we'll get links to all the variables we selected. It'll show what studies and what data sets they're part of. And then we can download either a custom codebook if we want documentation just for these. We'll take a look at what that looks like. There we are. And this is useful because it's going to be a code book that has 9 pages instead of, if you got the code book for all 3 waves of NCHAP, I think it's probably thousands of pages. But this has just the stuff I care about. It has all the metadata provided for each of these variables by the study. And you'll notice I didn't select these variables at the top, but it's automatically including several variables like ID and weight variables as they've configured the portal to do. But then we can get down to the ones that we actually added. Use the age here. In this case, it's actually renaming the variables because when we do the data extract, we can't have 3 separate variables called marital LST. So it prefixes each one with a wave kind of mnemonic that will create separate columns with those different names. So it's kind of performing this merge across the different data sets and providing it to us nicely with just a single data set, fully documented and labeled. So then we can download that data. Currently, we support 2 different download formats, so CSV and also SPSS. So if I choose one of those, it's going to create that data extract in the background, and then I can open that up in SPSS, see the data there, get all the documentation that's included with it in the variables view, and then start my analysis or exploration of that data. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn back to some slides to talk a little bit about the metadata structure that is used to power this portal. And I guess even before that, just a very high-level view of what steps the NACDA folks used to prepare this documentation, because we provided the software for this project, but the NACDA folks did all the actual, intellectual work of mapping these to common measurements descriptions. So it's really a 4-step process, and the first 2 steps were sort of done before the project. So the first step is to document the concordance and the variables within each study. So NHATS had done that a number of years ago, actually, using DDI-Lifecycle and Colectica. And SHAP did it more recently as kind of a precursor to the cross-study stuff. But they both did the basic data set and variable documentation, and then created what we call conceptual variables within their studies. So there's separate sets of conceptual variables that they're all saying they measure. The third step then, given that these are described with different sets of conceptual variables, is to create a common set of conceptual variables that both studies can then map to. So NACDA did that, and then they took the final step, which is to map both of the conceptual variables from NHATS and NSHAP to those newly created common conceptual variables. All right, so to think a little bit more about the metadata structure within DDI that's actually used here, let's start at the very beginning. So what's a variable? It's a column in a data set. And so this is a really simple example with 4 columns, 4 variables. Variables have data types. So a name might be text, a height might be a number. Over at the right, the marital status could be coded as maybe S for single, M for married. In this case, there's just 2, pretty basic code set for this example. But sometimes if you get a third data set, perhaps there's a different coding. So the bottom one there has not just S and M, but also D for divorced, presumably. So we have a second different representation of the variable, but they're really still all measuring marital status, just a bit differently. So the DDI structure is shown here, and these are each, you can think of them as metadata items. And at the top, we have just this basic idea of marital status. So we're measuring marital status. We're not saying how we do it, what the code list looks like, or how we asked about it, or anything like that. It's just what we call a conceptual variable saying we measure marital status. In the middle, we get a little more detailed. We say, how are we measuring it? So in this example, we had 2 different ways we measure it. And so we have 2 different represented variables, as we call them. The first one on the left just has those 2 codes. The one on the right, we call it marital status plus, that has the third code added to it. And finally, at the bottom, we have the variables, which are describing the actual columns of data. And we'll notice those first 2 just use the S and M codes. And so they point to that represented variable on the left. The third one added a new code, so it points to the marital status plus representation on the right. But both of those point to the single idea that we're measuring marital status. So there's a lot going on there, but we've got tools to make that preparation more straightforward and to kind of make it more efficient. And once you have that structure in your metadata, you can do a lot of powerful things like run the portal that we just took a look at, for example. Some of the other benefits of using this, what we often call the variable cascade structure. So it's specifying this comparability and allowing that comparison across data sets. These variables don't need to be in the same data set. As long as they're documented in the same repository, metadata repository, we can do this. It also lets us kind of get a jump start on harmonizing across these data sets and studies. So if we did want to go further and do actual comparative analysis, we know how one variable in one study compares to one in the other. It's important to point out that we're not relying on variable names being equivalent or even following any sort of convention. Because of the metadata structure, the variables can be named anything at all. There's some underlying unique DDI identification that allows us to create these explicit relationships regardless of how the variables are named in the actual data sets. So this lets us see changes over time or across studies. And you can also picture using these conceptual variables and represented variables to help plan future data collection and future data sets to enable compatibility. So if I'm going to create a new wave, I can look at my previous waves and just say, let's use all these conceptual represented variables, and then the data should be comparable, at least at the, the structural level. If you're doing a new study and you want to replicate or just study a different population or whatever, but make it comparable to an existing study, again, it'd be great to use those conceptual represented variables to aid in that comparability. Okay, so that was actually describing within a single study. With across two studies like this NCHAP-NHATS project, the metadata structure gets a little bit different in order to make things more efficient. So in the case like this, where the separate studies have already done the concordance with separate sets of conceptual variables, what we do, as I mentioned NACDA did, is to create a common set of conceptual variables. And that allows a third party, like an archive such as NACDA, to do this concordance without changing each study's content that they've already done. A, not to duplicate the work, and B, NACDA doesn't have the technical rights or maybe political rights to edit the NHATS metadata, because NHATS did that over there and NACDA's over here. So they can do it externally using their own common conceptual variables, and then just map each study's individual conceptual variables to these new common conceptual variables. And so that metadata structure looks a bit like this, where at the top we have the common conceptual variable. The next level, the things that point to those, are the conceptual variables from each study. And then everything below that is kind of what we saw in the earlier metadata structure, where each study's variables point to represented variables, point to their own conceptual variables. So you get this big graph of relationships, essentially, that let you power an interactive codebook like the one that we took a look at a few minutes ago. And it's a similar structure whether you're doing a one-to-one mapping versus a many-to-one mapping. So in the case where it takes multiple variables like birth year and birth month from NHATS to map to a single sort of idea of measuring age, you can do that as well just by mapping both of those conceptual variables together to say, this is what measures age in our study. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it back to NACDA, and Catherine, I think, is going to discuss some further details of how this project worked.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay. And thank you, everybody, for your patience. That was really helpful. So I just wanted to touch on something that Jeremy demonstrated about what comes with the portal downloads. So when you download a customized data set for NCHAP, some variables automatically come in the file that is created. And to find out more about the NCHAP series and to see that list of variables, you would go from the portal homepage and you'd click on the NCHAP series hyperlink. And those variables include the person level weights, cluster, stratum, survey type, interview start date, and ID. And the other thing I wanted to mention was about the special missing. So in the process of doing the mapping for NCHAP and NHATS, we worked with our local DDI expert within ICPSR, and we decided that we'd focus on the valid data for now, because a lot of researchers might recode missing when they go to do their own analysis. But I definitely agree that seeing what aligns across this special missing could be a good idea for future work. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, now that you've seen it on the Colectica portal, that how you might find that data from our NACDA site. So if you go to our site and you search for NCHAP, you can see that I typed NCHAP into the search bar, and that you can see the waves 1, 2, and 3 come up. Each of those would lead to a study homepage, so that you can see that we offer a study search. We also offer results based on related publications, variables that might have that key term. So it doesn't look like that many data-related publications or variables, but that's because it's looking for the term NCHAP. You'll find out very different results if you actually go to the study pages or the series page and view the amount of data-related publications and variables. And then when you search our site, you also get the site results from announcements that we've made, which include relevant information about any given study. And so now I'm going to play a little screen recording that shows you what I mean when I talk about going to the series page for a collection like NCHAP. We also do this for MIDAS and other studies. And if you go to a series page, what you'll find is a description, and it will also show any studies linked to that series. And you can see there are 3 because NCHAP has 3 waves. There's a variables tab you can click on, which I did, and you can see that ICPSR also lists the variables across a series. And you can think of this in the same way. Both Colectica and this variable search are powered by DDI, but with ICPSR, you get this list-like search results as opposed to a table-like or calendar-like display. And you can see that if you were to search for gender across NCHAP series, you would see that gender shows up for wave 3, wave 1, and wave 2 in those first results. So it lets you know it is present across all 3. Okay, so maybe you've decided you want to download the whole data file or some documentation. You could do that by going to any of the study pages and clicking the download button on the left, or going to the Data and Documentation tab. You would have to select this. By default, the At a Glance tab is the first tab you see. But if you're in Data and Documentation, you could click the specific dataset level download buttons. Okay, you need to register to download for a MyData account. It's free. We don't collect any information to share with anybody, and we don't spam you. You might get an email from us now and then that pertains to relevant updates, but even that is manual effort. Nothing is automatic. We don't have any bots running to track you down. Okay. You might be wondering with registering, does your MyData account get you access to the portal? And the answer right now is no. This mapping that we've done and putting NCHAP and NHATS into Colectica is a proof of concept, and we look forward to putting more data into the portal and seeing how that goes. But each longitudinal portal is hosted independently, so you need to register for each one. When you download, you might notice from NACDA and ICPSR that a zip package is what you receive, and you might be wondering why. The reasons are pretty straightforward. We need to be able to support single and multi-data set structures, so a zip package is friendly for that. The other reason is for metadata concerns. So we want you to be able to keep sorted your data files and your documentation, especially if you're downloading multiple files. It could be very easy to get mixed up or lose information, and when we provide code books and other PDF documents that accompany a data set, it is really important to look through those and read them. They often contain information about merging as well as the weights, and so we just think it's best to keep it all together. Okay, so for NCHAP and other studies that are in Colectica portals like MIDAS, what you see is the public data, but you might be interested in accessing restricted data. And you would look, you would notice that data is restricted from the study page. It would have this access restricted data button. And if you click on it, you'll get this pop-up that tells you a little bit about how you might apply for access. So, so those are just some of the indicators, and then you could click on the use agreement and fill that out. And this is just a general, if you're accessing restricted data from NACDA, you want to download the agreement, read it, complete all of the required fields, provide any additional documentation. Some require IRBs. If you don't have a scanner, you can take a picture of it, but you could print it, sign it, scan it. We do prefer original signatures, but then we take digital versions, so you would email to us. We do accept some digital signatures. We understand that with COVID related limitations, it's just not practical for everybody to print and scan things. And we have a short video on our site about this process and what it, managing expectations as far as when you could expect to receive the data. So I mentioned our announcements page and how you could search for something from our site and look through the announcements. And this image just kind of shows you that if you search for NSHAP, we have 12 related announcements, and they vary from announcements about the types of releases to informational things. We also distribute a newsletter which you can subscribe to from our homepage. So check that out, and we send out a newsletter quarterly. Okay. So one of the last things I'm going to show you is that if you're on our site and you click on that data resources tab that Jim highlighted, you would see that we have individual pages for MIDAS and NSHAP. And if you go to one of those, you'll see that we kind of wanted to put everything in one place for you. So if you're wondering where to access the links to those portals or to the series pages, this is where you would go. And we also, if we do webinars that are relevant to those studies, we also post those, as well as we try to look for other relevant webinars from other parties and put them there. So it's kind of a nice all-in-one place to get your information for those studies. So just to recap, from the NACDA site, you can get whole data sets and download documentation, and you would merge the whole data files from there. We have a wide variety of file formats available. When you're choosing what to download, we have a list-like variable display, public and restricted data versions available, and access to relevant news and announcements. From the Colectica Portal that we host, you can search across longitudinal variables in a table-like display, and you can see the variable comparisons across multiple waves and studies, and we hope to add more. You can get customized data and documentation extracts. We have the NHATS metadata, as Jeremy mentioned, compared with the NSHAP series, and we have the data in the portal, the public data for that series. And as I mentioned, it's public data only. Both have user support and both are powered by DDI. Okay, so we are ready for your questions. If you want to stay connected, we have various social media. As you can see, there's our email and our site. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and for your patience during our technical difficulties. And thank you to our presenters. We're just so happy with the Colectica Portal. Jeremy and Dan do a great job.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I want to echo that. This is Anna at ICPSR, and I have learned so much today. So thank you for some incredible learnings. Our first question is, where is the link to the Colectica portal, and can I get to it from ICPSR or from the NACDA website?
Sure. So one of the last things I showed was this page here, which is an example for our highlighted NCHAP page. And as you can see to the right, there's this little download kind of icon, and it says NACDA Colectica Portal. And you can get to that, to the portal from that link. Jeremy also included the link to the portal in the presentation in here, so that's you can access it. But it's highlighted on the MIDAS and NSHAP study pages. So, yeah, it's harmonized.icpsr.umich.edu, I believe.
Yeah, and it looks like I just tried a Google search for like NACDA harmonized. That would get you there pretty quickly too.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Great, thank you. The second question is, I guess kind of a general question. What studies are there in the Colectica portal, and will there be others added?
So in the NACDA Colectica portal, we have NSHAP, where you can access the metadata across the series as well as download data. We have the comparison of NSHAP to NHATS, but we don't host the NHATS data. They have their own portal. They disseminate their own data. So that's where you would go to get the data.
We're looking forward to putting more into the portal. Midas has their own portal where they host the data, but we're hoping to map Midas to these other studies very soon.
Yeah,
Yep.
the proof of concept for the NCHAP project and the comparison project were highly successful. So we want to push forward aggressively and start adding other important NIA studies that we distribute to the portal so people can use these longitudinal studies more effectively. I'm sorry, Jeremy?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, because I don't know if we made it totally clear. So Colectica Portal itself is just off-the-shelf software that different organizations can deploy with their own content. The one we looked at today at NACDA has the studies Catherine mentioned, and hopefully adding more. So yeah, other organizations run them, like Midas. This Closer project out of the UK runs a Colectica Portal for 8 or 9 of the British cohort studies. And there's many other instances of Colectica Portal out there for other data sets. We link to some of them from our website, so you can check that out to access a few more of them too.
Perfect, thank you. Third question, how is version control maintained between what is in the portal versus what's available through the NACDA website?
Thank you. So the NACDA site for the NCHAP data should be considered the authoritative version. And similar for NHATS, what NHATS disseminates should be the authoritative version. We would, as far as sequence of events, we would update the portal once we have the data updated. In the event that we have a reason to update it, we would do the portal after we update whatever's on our site. So, and you know, this isn't the same across the portals to my understanding. Like for Midas, I think that the most recent version would be available in their portal, and then you could expect to find that same version available through us within a very short turnaround time after any update would have occurred.
Great, thank you. I see we have 3 questions, and to our speakers, I'm noticing that we are close to our end time, so we may go slightly over. Participants, if you are able to stay with us, that would be lovely. I just saw one more question come in. Great, so I see a question. This is for Jeremy. In your demonstration of the Colectica platform, you showed that it displays conceptual variables. Can you elaborate on the meaning of that?
Yeah, so the conceptual variable is just a generic idea of what you're measuring. So age could be a conceptual variable, or marital status could be a conceptual variable. And we use that to organize those displays and the search that we looked at. It's not getting into specifics about, oh, it's, you know, column 23 in this data set, and the code list used to measure it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 1 equals single and 2 equals married, or something like that. Those are at the variable level documentation. So the conceptual variable is basically just a really generic idea of something that you measure. I hope that's sort of clear.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, we had a question. Will the webinar slides be available after this presentation?
Yes, we will share the slides and the recording. We like to make sure that all of our materials are ADA compliant. So once we get captioning on the recording, it'll be more publicly shared, but registered, those who registered should get the information pretty shortly after. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, this question is, do you think the approach you have taken could be extended to harmonize with other studies on similar portals?
Yes. We are actually working on a working paper to talk about this process, and we are hoping to be able to share that soon. So we can definitely send that out to the list of registrants for this webinar if you're interested in knowing more about the process. But definitely the approach, the idea was, as Jeremy described, where we were very familiar with NSHAP, and NHATS had already done the work for their own portal, and so we were able to kind of take that familiarity from both and create these new concepts that crossed both of them. And I think that like this kind of thing, you might have seen similar approaches with like common data elements or other things, and like the closer portal, it's a very similar idea where we're trying to take things that different data sets, different studies have in common, and then make it more, I don't know, more available and easier to discover for researchers so that they can determine, okay, what does indeed need to be recoded and harmonized so that they can be more the same. But, if we did that exact harmonization on our own, we might miss out on seeing some other similarities across the studies that just because they maybe aren't the exact same, such as the age and the birth month and birth year thing, that you wouldn't think to find. So I definitely think this approach could be used across other portals or studies.
Perfect, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. So participants, thank you for such incredible questions. We are going to take these last questions that are already in, and then we're going to close the questions for now, but you are always welcome to reach out to these teams with any additional questions. You can always reply to your webinar registration email as well, and we can get those questions over to them. The next question is, how long did it take you to set up the information using Colectica?
So let's see. We did that work between roughly September, October of last year and March, April of this year. We gave our final crosswalk to the Colectica team maybe sometime, I think around late February or beginning of March, and they turned it around for us within about a month, I would say, within March or very early April. And so previously, when we had done the work to get NSHAP into the portal, I think that we had a similar time frame of kind of like late summer of one year to the first quarter of the following year. And again, we handed it over to Colectica, but the approaches were slightly different each time, because for NSHAP, our DDI expert within ICPSR, Sonda, she actually used the Colectica software to manipulate DDI for the portal to be used basically for the input. But this time around, because we already had basically the DDI for NSHAP and the DDI for NHATS, because Colectica had them, we just provided the crosswalk, and they were able to create an automated script that kind of pulled everything together. So so I can separate them out and tell you that, like I said, between late summer and first quarter of the following year for each project, but really the one couldn't have happened without the other. And then on top of that, you have to consider that NSHAP was already curated within ICPSR prior to putting the information into the portal. So there was efforts from NORC to make their collections consistent across the waves. There was work that ICPSR curation staff did to make sure that the data were, clean and converted properly. So yeah, a lot of effort, but the actual working with Colectica happened within, a few months, I would say.
Great, thanks, Catherine. A question that has come in: if one study has marital status M and S, and another study has marital status M and S and D, does Colectica explain where the D people go in the study with only M and S?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, not currently. I think that would be that extra step I mentioned as a potential future direction, where to map the actual codes from one study to another. Like if you wanted to say that, so S is single, M is married, and D is divorced, perhaps you'd want to map all the divorced to be single so that you had sort of a consistent mapping there. So no, we're not doing that with this project right now. That would be the idea of doing that individual code level mapping to a single code list.
Great, thank you. There was a question about the white paper that was mentioned. Is there somewhere that people might be able to access that?
Right, so we are in progress with it still. So when it's finalized, we will definitely put an announcement on our site. We can email the registrants of this webinar, but it's not accessible right now. It's almost done.
Fabulous, thank you. And then last question, can you talk more about the data curation process, including the time and staff and resources that were needed?
These really are amazing questions. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so the curation process. Well, ICPSR is curation. You know, I mean, we're a data archive, but we like to archive in the best possible manner and according to, you know, federal standards. But basically, what happens is we receive data and they can come in any kind of format from any kind of source, from any PI, and we take it and we turn it into SPSS SAS data R, ASCII, and syntax, as well as a PDF codebook. And again, I mentioned that our variable search is powered by DDI, so that means we also create DDI for every single data set that comes in. And we also create metadata at the collection level. So when you're viewing study pages, that's exactly what makes the data that we receive discoverable from our site and from Google. So the curation process for me means we do everything that needs to be done in order for you to be able to search and find data. So and we also have, you know, a computing team within ICPSR and a web team and a finance team, and so everybody kind of does their part to make sure that you can go to our site and press that download button. As far as what that means at a granular level, it means that we've got people putting in the human effort to look through those variables and see, you know, what might be inconsistent, and we try to provide documentation for everything we can and alert PIs. Like, say we can't resolve an inconsistency, we try to at least alert the PI to it so that we know to anticipate possible user questions. That's another thing. We also have user support. So curation is at our core, and the time and effort, it's every day, you know, 5 days a week. And I don't know, there are multiple other units within ICPSR that contribute to make that process happen. So it's kind of like, if you think about text mining or any other kind of automated thing that can happen, those automated things cannot happen without the human effort. And so that human effort is really our curation process. We do have some automated tools to help with it, to help with the conversion and whatnot. But at the end of the day, again, we are dealing with thousands of different data sources, thousands of different PIs, thousands of different data sets. So it's a huge endeavor, and we're very happy to do it. And my director just sent me a note saying it's really at least 6 days a week in order to make these data available to you all 24/7.
He's right. That's pretty fun. Well, fabulous. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you so much to all of our attendees. This has been absolutely an incredible session. If you do have additional questions, please do reach out to ICPSR-NACDA umich.edu. We'd be happy to answer anything additional. And thank you again. The recording and slides will be available to all the registrants from this webinar, and we very much look forward to seeing you at a future event here at ICPSR. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.